Hey, all you cool cats and kittens. It's your favorite history teacher back at you again with another historical video. And today we have a doozy. We have one of the larger lectures to cover. So, where I might be going off on some tangents, um, I only get 40 free minutes of Zoom recording. We got to go quick, but there are a lot of test questions. This is chock full. We're talking about America and its war effort on the home front. So we got a lot to cover in so little time. So let's get into it. Module 11, lesson 4. We're almost done with the module. So test coming soon. That was your warm up. Okay, so objectives. As you can see, it's chock full of objectives in this module. Explain how the U.S. expanded its armed forces in World War II. Trace the efforts of the U.S. government to control the economy, inspire Americans on the home front. Describe the wartime mobilization of industry, labor, scientists, and the media. Summarize both the opportunities and the discrimination African Americans and other minorities experienced during the war. And explain the decision to place Japanese Americans and German and Italian enemy aliens in internment camps. All right, military gains. So after Pearl Harbor, patriotic young American men mostly jammed military recruiting offices. Even the 5 million who volunteered for military service were not enough to face the challenge of an all-out war on two fronts. So the Selective Service system expanded the draft and eventually provided another 10 million soldiers to meet the armed forces demand. If you remember, the Selective Training and Service Act required 16 million aged 21 to 35 to sign up, and only 1 million were drafted. So they got some more people. All the Americans entering the armed forces needed training and housing. This required hundreds of new military bases and training centers. The military buildup changed many parts of the country. For example, California played a huge role in America's war effort. Military bases grew from 16 to 41, more than those of the next 5 states combined. Yes, California played a vital role. A lot of these military bases needed drier climates and nicer weather, so that that they could train easier. Volunteers and draftees reported to these and other military bases across the country. After 8 weeks of basic training, seasoned sergeants did their best to turn raw recruits into disciplined, battle-ready GIs in a short period of time. Army Chief of Staff George Marshall, that name will become a bigger important part later on in the war, was the leader of the armed forces mobilization. Again, mobilization means getting ready for war, and he ensured that all American soldiers were well equipped and properly trained. So here you got some soldiers getting ready, lifting weights, and they turn into GIs. General issue. Here's a map of military bases in California. Now, I know these are probably military bases nowadays, but I mean, it's not all 41, but you can imagine California was littered with military bases. More on that later. That's George Marshall. All right, the WASC and the WASC, the whack and the wasp. Military The military's workforce was in such dire straits that George Marshall will push for the formation of the Women's Auxiliary Army Corps, or the WAC. Women volunteers would serve in non-combat positions. However, test question: some members of Congress called this bill the silliest piece of legislation they ever had. That's kind of sexist. Despite its opposition, the WAAC became law May 15th, 1942. The WAC Act gave women official status and salary, but few of the benefits that male soldiers received. Even so, thousands of women patriotically joined. July 1943, the U.S. Army dropped auxiliary and gave members of the Women's Army Corps full U.S. Army benefits. They worked as nurses, ambulance drivers, radio operators, electricians, and pilots. More than 1,000 women who had been trained as pilots before the war also signed up for duty. They will form the Women Air Force Service Pilots, or WASP. They flew non-combat missions as well, transporting supplies, moving aircraft between bases, and testing new planes. Cornelia Fort was the first woman to sign up for the WASP, and she, your book says, witnessed Pearl Harbor's attack from the air. Fun times. That's not a fun time. I take that back. Do not quote me on that. Here you have some posters influencing women to join the armed forces. Here's the WASP, and that's Cornelia Fort. Double V. So for many minority groups, African Americans, Native Americans, Mexican Americans, Asian Americans, the war created new difficulties. They would be restricted to racially segregated neighborhoods and reservations. They were denied basic citizenship rights, and some questioned whether or not this war was theirs to fight. Why fight for a country if they're not going to let me vote? Come on. Some African Americans saw the war effort as an opportunity to fight this discrimination. Across the country, African American newspapers supported the Double V campaign. There was a government poster going around with the slogan V is for victory, which inspired the campaign. This campaign will also inspire African Americans to join together to support the war effort. Their hope was that African Americans would win 2 victories, meaning double V, victory at home, victory over the country's enemies abroad, and 1 over their poor treatment at home. Victory at home, victory abroad. Double V, test question. Nationalism inspired these contributions that made many African Americans believe that their situations could actually improve. So there you got a double V. Minorities with major contributions. Despite discrimination in the military, more than 300,000 Mexican Americans joined the armed forces. About 1 million African Americans served in the military. African American soldiers lived and worked in segregated units. Limited to mostly non-combat roles until protests up the chain of command saw that African Americans got their wish of seeing combat in April 1943. Asian Americans also took part in the struggle. More than 13,000 Chinese Americans joined. 33,000 Japanese Americans joined. Several thousands of those men and women were served as spies and interpreters in the Pacific theater of World War II. Some 25,000 Native Americans enlisted in the armed forces, including 800 women. There you have African Americans, Mexican Americans, Chinese Americans, Japanese Americans, Native Americans. All right, better prepared. So FDR will create a series of agencies in order to aid the management of the war effort even before Pearl Harbor even happened. Remember, the war starts in 1939, Pearl Harbor in 1941. So he had 2 years to start something. The Office of War Mobilization was created in 1943 to oversee the agencies and coordinate all wartime efforts. American leaders understood that public support for the war effort was vital to its success. You don't want it to be like a little Vietnam and have people disregard the war and the people fighting it and saying it's a bad choice to be off in war. So American public opinion needed to support it. So June 1942, the government will create the Office of War Information, OWI. Test question. It was responsible for spreading propaganda to influence the thoughts, the feelings, and the actions of the public in favor of the war effort. The OWI produced dozens of posters and films encouraging a positive vision for of the U.S. and stressing positive actions like joining the Army, working in war industries, or saving resources at home. There's the picture of the Office of War Mobilization, the OWI, economy on lock. Due to their World War I experience, U.S. government officials knew that wartime inflation could threaten the country. When inflation occurs, each dollar that a person earns will buy fewer goods and services than it did before. Think of that statement again. Say it to yourself. When every dollar a person makes, it will buy fewer goods and services than it did before. We have all experienced inflation in the last 2 years, so you guys know what I'm talking about. As war production increased, fewer consumer products were available, with demand increasing and supplies dropping. Prices seemed likely to climb. So FDR responded to this threat by creating the Office of Price Administration, the OPA. The OPA, test question, fought inflation by freezing prices on most goods. Congress will also raise income tax rates and extended that tax to millions of people who had never paid it before. As a result, workers had less money to spend and it will reduce consumer demand on scarce goods, keeping inflation low. The government will also encourage Americans to buy war bonds with their extra cash. As a result of these measures, inflation remained below 30% the entire period of the war. Half of that number was all of World War One. So a little over 50% inflation. Can you believe that? Almost double, almost, oof. Can't imagine that. So these measures helped fund the war effort. Some estimates for the entire preparation of the war was about $300 billion. Remember, wars cost money. After restructuring the tax system, Congress created the withholding system of payroll deductions to collect income taxes. Employers withheld a percentage of their workers' pay each paycheck and sent the money directly that they kept to the Treasury Department. The money ordinary citizens invested in war bonds also helped pay for the war. 85 million people bought a total amount worth in bonds, $185 billion. Besides the economy, the government also had to make sure the armed forces and war industries received their resources they needed. The War Production Board test question decided on which companies would change from peacetime production to wartime production, allocating raw materials to key industries and organized drives to collect scrap and recycled materials. He's first, you're next. Let's share the meat. We'll talk about rationing in a bit. And you got all these posters. All right, gardens and rations. So, meeting the food needs of the military took top priority of the U.S. One way to grow more food for Americans on the home front was to plant victory gardens. Test question. Victory gardens? Americans will farm on small plots of land to overcome food shortages. However, victory gardens couldn't alone fulfill the nation's food needs. Some foods couldn't be grown at home, so there were shortages on other products too. As a result, the OPA set up a system of rationing, or establishing fixed allotments of use of goods deemed essential for the military. Under this system, households received ration books with coupons. Think of it, it's like a big old coupon book to be used for buying such scarce goods like meat, shoes, sugar, coffee, gasoline. Many Americans accepted rationing as a personal contribution to their war effort. Some materials were so vital to the war effort that even rationing was not enough to preserve the country's supply. Rubber, which was in high demand during the war, most of the world's rubber supply came from parts of Asia that were conquered by Japan. So scientists will develop a new synthetic rubber and other synthetic materials to fill that void. Victory gardens, there you go, small plots of land. Here are some ration books. They're kind of like big old coupons. You pay 5 stamps, you get your, 2-pound steak. Okay, R&D. FDR created the Office of Scientific Research and Development, OSRD, to bring scientists into the war effort. The OSRD stimulated improvements in semiconductor technology, which was vital for communications equipment, leading to the development of radar and sonar. Seen up above and down below, the OSRD scientists worked to develop new weapons tech like new bombs, guided missiles, and other aircraft tech. The OSRD also supported research in life-saving medications such as penicillin, which saved countless of American lives on and off the battlefield. The OSRD also encouraged the use of pesticides like DDT to fight insects, and it would free people from body lice. The most significant achievement of the OSRD was the secret development of the new weapon, the atomic bomb. Interest and intrigue of building this weapon began back in 1939 when German scientists split uranium atoms, which released an enormous amount of energy. German scientist Albert Einstein wrote a letter to FDR that Germany would use this discovery to build a weapon so destructive in power. Roosevelt responded by creating the Advisory Committee on Uranium to study this new discovery. The committee reported that in 1941 it would take 5 years to build. It set up in 1942 a program to develop a nuclear bomb ASAP. Much of the early research was completed at Columbia University in Manhattan, so that's kind of where this name, test question. The code name for the research project that was done across the country was called the Manhattan Project. So people didn't even know what they were building when they would go to work in the factories because the Manhattan Project was top secret. There's some Breaking Bad for you. The OSRD. Radar on the left, sonar on the right. Penicillin. These are the Manhattan Project sites across the country. Shipping delays. So all the products made in American factories had to be shipped to soldiers overseas. Soldiers on both fronts needed weapons, food, medicines, and other supplies. Much of that responsibility for transporting the goods fell on the U.S. Merchant Marine, a fleet of civilian merchant ships. More than 200,000 Americans served in the Merchant Marine. With battles raging on two fronts, transporting goods presented a huge challenge. Any goods transported across the Atlantic or the Pacific had to cross an area controlled by the enemy ships, submarines, and planes. For their safety, these merchant ships traveled in convoys escorted by warships. Even with such precautions, merchant shipping was dangerous as dozens were sunk and tens of thousands of sailors were killed. Some products made it more challenging to ship, such as food and many medicines. Research will develop methods to freeze dry vital medical supplies like penicillin and blood plasma. So there you have it. There's a convoy. Production miracle. So early 1942, American newspapers reported the end of the automobile production for private use. Within several weeks of shutting down production, the nation's automobile plants had to be retooled. They began to produce tanks, planes, boats, and command cars. Across the nation, factories were quickly converted to war production. Mechanical pencil makers made bomb parts. Bedspread manufacturers made mosquito netting. And soft drink companies went from filling bottles with liquid and filling shells with explosives. Shipyards and defense plants also exploded at dizzying speed. By the end of 42, industrialist Henry J. Kaiser, yes, that Kaiser, your Kaiser Permanente, built 7 massive new shipyards that turned out Liberty ships, tankers, troop transports, and baby aircraft carriers. His shipyards, Kaiser shipyards, were built with such prefabricated, factory-made parts that could be assembled quickly at shipyards. Equally as important were those workers who worked at record speeds. I will like to say this, that Henry Kaiser did provide health benefits for his workers. That's kind of why Kaiser's called Kaiser. When the war began, defense contractors warned that the Selective Service system of the nation did not have enough workers to meet its industrial needs. Patriotism spread as men joined the military. Others joined jobs in factories to support the war effort. Women. Despite the draft, 18 million workers were laboring in war industries by 1944, 3 times of that since 1991. 1941. Swept up in the wave of patriotism, laborers threw themselves into the war effort fully. They worked long hours with few breaks, and labor unions pledged not to strike. However, when prices rose, union leaders were asked to fight for higher wages. So, test question, to combat potential production slowdown, FDR established the National War Labor Board, NWLB, in 1942 to serve as a mediator between labor and management and to prevent strikes. It prevented protests about wages by settling limits on wage increases. To also protect union stability, they also banned workers from quitting or changing jobs while also employed. There you have a Kaiser shipyard. This is Henry Kaiser in the back, the bald guy. That's Kaiser Permanente. Together we win. Get behind your labor management committee. All right, workers. So among those committed to working in war industries were more than 6 million women who wanted to support their country. At first, war industries feared that women lacked the necessary strength for factory work and were reluctant to hire them. Women proved them that they could operate welding torches or riveting guns. After that, employers could not hire enough of them because women were paid 60% less than men. And might as well hire them all. So, test question. Rosie the Riveter was inspired by a popular song of the era, and her image was that of a strong woman hard at work in an arms factory. It became an enduring symbol of these women and their contributions to the war. Despite the plants also will hire 2 million more minority workers, African American, Mexican American, Asian American, Native American, and like women, many minorities face strong prejudice at first. 75% of defense contractors refused to hire African Americans, and I believe 15% only hired them for menial jobs. Many workers in new factories had also previously worked on farms, and some of the soldiers did too. The departure of so many workers from American farms led to a severe shortage in agricultural laborers. Despite the possibility of low harvest, the U.S. government launched a new program, which was called the Bracero program, or hired hands. They were invited to the U.S. to work on farms. In theory, the Bracero program guaranteed that all workers would receive fair pay and equal treatment under the law. In practice, many farm owners ignored these guidelines, so they shorted the guy's day and gave him shorted the worker's day, shorted the workers' pay and gave them inadequate tools for their work. That seems a little messed up, don't you think? I think so. Here you got Rosie the Riveter. We can do it. This is the Rosie the Riveter Museum in Richmond. I've been there. This is not my picture, though. Here you have the Braceros. All right, marches and migrations. So to protest discrimination in the military and in industry, A. Philip Randolph, remember that guy? We've heard him before. Organized a march on Washington. He was the founder and leader of the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters. Let me know if that rings a bell. The nation's most respected African American labor leaders. He said, "We, loyal colored Americans, demand the right to work and fight for our country." FDR feared that the march might provoke white resentment or violence, so he called Randolph to the White House and asked him to back down. Randolph refused and said he was going to bring 100,000 protesters to D.C., a city still largely segregated. In the end, it would be FDR who backed down. In return for Randolph's promise to cancel the march, FDR issued an executive order creating the Fair Employment Practices Committee. It called for employers and labor unions to provide full and equitable participation of all workers in defense industries without discrimination of those race, creed, color, or national origin. Sounds familiar. During the war, thousands of African Americans will leave the South and move to the Midwest and West where they can find better jobs. It's the second Great Migration. Wherever African Americans moved, however, discrimination presented tough hurdles. In 1942, James Farmer founded an interracial organization called the Congress of Racial Equality. Its purpose was to confront urban segregation in the North. Violence broke out against the country in 1943 and Detroit. And there was some violence between whites and blacks after false rumors. 25 blacks, 9 whites were dead and dying after FDR had to send in federal troops to stop people from fighting each other. The violence in 1943 showed that both blacks and whites, just how serious racial tensions have become in the U.S. So here you have the Second Great Migration. Zoot suit. So Mexican Americans also experienced prejudice during the war years. In the violent summer of 43, Los Angeles exploded into anti-Mexican zoot suit riots. The zoot suit, however, was a style of dress adopted by Mexican American youth to symbolize their rebellion against tradition. They had long jackets, pleated pants, and accompanied with a broad-brimmed hat. The riots began when 11 sailors in Los Angeles, LA, Los Angeles, reported that they were attacked by zoot suit wearing Mexican Americans. Who are you going to believe? This charge triggered violence involving thousands of servicemen and civilians. Mobs poured into Mexican neighborhoods, grabbed any zoot suiters they could find, and ripped them off their clothes and beat them senseless. These riots lasted a week. Native Americans also faced forms of discrimination. Even though that they were one of the most enthusiastic volunteers in military service, many states still prohibited them from voting, or local policies prevented them from casting ballots. During the war, the federal government actually reclaimed some of their reservation land for their own use. So they would build or enlarge military bases or weapons testing areas. Much of Native American land would be mined and its valuable resources taken from them. So about $39 million worth in resources, and in return, the Native Americans only got six million in compensation. Pretty big gap. So this is a zoot suit. These overly baggy pants, these wide I forget what this word is, but I want to call it a collar. It's not that, but look at how outlandish it is. And people did not like it. Okay, not only because they were racist, right? They thought, well, dress, this style of dress, this suit is a big waste of fabric. That fabric could be used for soldiers. And that's why people were also pissed off with these Mexican Americans, because they were wearing articles of clothing that took a lot of a scarce good like cloth or satin, cotton, whatever, which could in turn be used for the war and not for personal use. That's why people were upset. All right, the stain of America. So, test question all around. German and Italian immigrants who hadn't finished their citizenship paperwork were considered, quote, enemy aliens, and they were put in prison camps. But the worst was left for the Japanese. So, yes, if they were not fully citizens, they got thrown into these prison camps, German and Italian. When the war began, there were 120,000 Japanese Americans, JPAMs, Japanese Americans living in the U.S., mostly on the West Coast. After Pearl Harbor, however, a wave of prejudice came against them, as panic-stricken Americans feared the Japanese would soon attack the United States. In early 1942, the War Department called for the mass evacuation of Japanese Americans from Hawaii. The military governor of Hawaii refused this order, as 37% of Hawaiians were Japanese, and removing them by force would kill its economy. Not to say that there's a lot. He was eventually forced to order the internment of just 1,444 Japanese Americans, 1% of Hawaii's count total. February 19th, 1942, test question, final question. I should change that. FDR issued Executive Order 9066 requiring the removal of people of Japanese ancestry from California. That should be Washington, WA, Oregon, and Arizona. He justified this step as necessary for national security, still recommended by the U.S. military. In the next weeks, the Army will round up 110,000 Japanese Americans and send them to remote relocation centers, prison camps, basically prison camps. Were they treated as bad as probably some German or Italian aliens? Probably not. But if you think of an internment camp, think of a concentration camp, there you go. So, About 2/3 of these 110,000 were Nisei, meaning Japanese people born in this country of parents who immigrated from the Japan, which are the Issei. Nisei, Issei. Probably test question. No specific charges were ever filed against these Japanese Americans, and no evidence of subversion was ever found. So all this hoopla for nothing. Japanese Americans also fought for justice, both in Congress and in the courts. Test question 1944 Korematsu versus the United States. The government's policy of evacuating Japanese Americans to camps was justified under the Constitution of the basis of military necessity. After the war, the Japanese American Citizen League, Jackal, pushed the government to compensate those in the camps who lost their property. In 1965, Congress authorized the payment of about $38 million, which is actually 1/10 of all actual work lost during this time. In 1978, Jackal called for the payment of reparations to each individual who suffered in internment. So a decade later, Ronald Reagan actually signed the bill into law and promised $20,000 to every Japanese sent to the camp. And if you recall, I'm probably sure that they kept with their I just lost it. They kept track of who was living, who was dead from the Japanese internment because $20,000, while it might sound like a lot in the late 80s, computers are monitors at least are not that I don't even know what I'm saying right now. So a decade later, Ronald Reagan will sign this bill that promised 20,000 to every Japanese American sent to a camp. Checks were sent out in 1990 by Senior Bush, H.W. Bush. So 1990, they asked for help. They asked for reparation payments since 1965. Crazy to think 1990 1965, that's 25 years of asking for compensation for being put into internment camps. Okay, the stain of America is still there, and that's why you need to know. Not good, not good by any means. There you got Japanese persons living in ancestry. You got Japanese American families moving. Let me know if that looks like a concentration camp because it looks like it to me. And there's Fred Korematsu and Ronald Reagan. And then that's the letter. All right, so we are done. Phewie. Lots of lots of things. I know I stumbled reading some of those. I'm a little tired. I'm a little tired. So your homework is page 533, 4 through 7. Page 543, 4 through 7. I know there was a lot. A lot. I know there was a lot. There was a lot. But it's so jam-packed full of information that while sometimes in the past this might have been talked about in just one section or multiple sections in a textbook, or maybe even its own chapter, your textbook puts it into one. And it was 14 pages long. So hopefully you guys did enjoy that. If you did, make sure you hit that like button, leave a comment, subscribe. I'll see you in the next one. Peace.